Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/NotCreativeEdel1. A camping trip with a terrifying unexpected visitor. So, this isn't a story about me, but a story one of my good friends told me, when describing his recent camping trip with another of our friends. And I'll start by saying, I believe every word he says, because of the fear I saw in his eyes when he told me about this series of events, and because of something that was said to me by my father, that I'll get to at the end of this telling. Davis is the one telling me this story, and he's with Keenan. Edit. It was brought to my attention by a reader that the way I have this story worded is a bit confusing, as far as deciphering who is speaking. I was advised that maybe instead of telling the story in my point of view, with Davis telling me the story, that I should tell it as if Davis was the one talking to you readers. So, what you will be reading from here on out, will be in the perspective of Davis. My entries with my father will still follow at the end of the story. So, we lived a very beautiful Washington state. Mountains, woods, camping galore. Well, Keenan and I decide to take advantage of a couple days off in the middle of the week that we both shared during the summer, so we go out to an area in the national forest about a few hours from where we live, somewhere around Susan Creek. We decide on a small campsite in the area to camp, set up, and on goes our night. Now, we were camping on a Wednesday night, so we were the only ones in the campsite. Something we thought was nice at first, but would later realize wasn't nice at all. Everything was normal: campfire, shared stories, a couple beers amongst friends, and so on. It's getting late, so we jump in the tent and go to bed for the night. And it begins. I wake up in the middle of the night to Keenan having night terrors. He's shouting and flailing and whatnot. I turn on my flashlight and wake him up and tell him he's just having a bad dream, attempting to calm him down. Keenan gets up and regains his cool and tells me he dreamt that someone or something was in the tent with us, and it wasn't right. Nothing about it was. I tell him again, it was just a dream, relax and get some sleep, and turn off my flashlight. Well, a couple minutes later, I see Keenan's silhouette still standing there in the tent, and getting a bit frustrated I say, Keenan, it was nothing, lay down and get to sleep. I then feel Keenan bump me on my arm, and say, I'm laying right here, what are you talking about? I was still looking at the silhouette as Keenan muttered those words. I didn't say anything, I just froze. Felt ice in my bones and felt the most genuine sense of fear I've ever felt. And I stared at it, for what felt like ages. Eventually I just assumed my eyes were playing tricks, until Keenan whispered, Davis, do you see that thing standing in our tent? At this point I came unglued. Completely freaked. Screaming, flailing, you name it. Then it reared up. It was very tall, given the space in our tent. Skinny arms, extremely long fingers, probably 8 inches long, inverted legs like a flamingo, and pure black. It reared up, turned around and ripped out of our tent, and off it went crashing into the night. At that point we had never ran faster in our lives. Left everything and ran straight for the car and off we went. Now, a couple weeks had passed. And I get a phone call in the middle of the night from Keenan. And Keenan is hysterical. He tells me that he was at a friend's house for a while, and he went back to his car to leave. Well, his friend has quite a long driveway and Keenan found parking maybe in 1/8 mile up the driveway. Friend lives in a very rural area around here. Well, Keenan's car was having difficulty starting. He'd turn the key, starter would engage, lights would come on, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He did this a number of times, and in his effort noticed a cat in the middle of the drive looking at him, illuminated by the headlights turning on and off. Well, finally, Keenan's car fired up. But where the cat was sitting, was now that creature, standing broadside and staring at him. But only for a second, because at that moment, it took of running and jumped a massive creek, and off into the woods it ran. Keenan immediately called me, while tearing out of there like a bat out of hell. And that's the last we heard or saw of this thing. What you just read was in the perspective of Davis. How he told me this story, almost word for word. Now is where it gets weird for me. I'm fascinated by this story, almost jealous I wasn't there to witness it. I'm sitting in my parents' living room, and I start telling them this story, because I know they would be intrigued. About the time I got the part of the creature tearing out of their tent, my father interrupts and says, "Where were they, Susan?" Mind you, I never knew where they went camping. Davis had left that part out, whether intentionally or not, I don't know. I told my dad I wasn't sure, but I was curious, so I sent Davis a message asking where they were at while camping. His reply still sends shivers down my spine. It was simple, Susan Creek, why? I didn't reply. I just looked at my dad and said, "How did you know that?" He told me that my cousin Josh had gone out there camping around hunting season, and something happened to him out there. He said my cousin couldn't explain it, and wouldn't even try explaining, but that he refused to ever go back. Refusing to go anywhere near the area for that matter. That bit there sealed it for me. I was convinced they were telling the truth. I don't know what it was. I don't know what happened there. Susan is a Native American name for sure, maybe it's related. Or not. Second story. The Wendigo. This story was shared by you/the inspector. Everyone in the force knew Marconi had a girlfriend, and it wasn't a big deal. We sometimes saw her hanging around the station when Marconi was getting off her shift. She was a kind-faced woman, frizzy brown hair, thin where Marconi was stocky, always wearing something bright and flowery. Marconi didn't say much about her personal life, so we knew very little about this mystery visitor. I don't think we even knew her name. She was just another fixture around the station, like Larry the Drunk Wonder, who we brought into the holding cells every Friday like clockwork. But when she came to the front desk one misty morning, we almost didn't recognize her at first. She'd traded her floral blouse for a subdued gray shirt and jeans, and her frizzy hair was tied back in a tight bun. It didn't look like she was wearing any makeup. Abigail Shannon, our newest recruit, was working the desk that day, and she gave the visitor a dim smile. "Name?" she asked. "Janine," the woman answered. "Janine Zimmerman." She swallowed nervously. "I'd like to report a missing person." I was busy grabbing my third coffee of the morning, but when I heard the tremor in her voice, I turned to look at her. She didn't seem to know what to do with her hands. They played at her hair, then fell to the counter, then drummed a rhythm on her thigh. Eventually she settled for wringing them the way one might squeeze a wet dishcloth. Abigail pulled out the necessary forms and grabbed a pen from the top drawer. "Can you give me the name of the missing person?" she asked. A sense of dread crept over me, and I knew, even before she opened her mouth, what name she was about to say. I placed the coffee pot back on the counter before it could slip from my sweaty hands. Her voice faint, Janine said, "Olivia Marconi." I ducked into the men's room, lit up the inspector's card with my pocket lighter, and dropped the flaming piece of plastic into the sink. By the time the fire had died down and I'd returned to the main office, the inspector was already there. He and Nico Sanchez were ushering Janine into one of the interrogation rooms down the hall. I slipped in behind them before the door could close. Sanchez offered the flustered woman a chair and sat down across from her. The inspector and I remained standing. I noticed that his cigar was smaller than usual, closer to a cigarette, really, and the smoke issuing from it was thin and wispy. I wondered what had caused the change. "Why don't you walk us through what happened?" Sanchez said in his best good cop voice. "When did you notice the sheriff was missing?" Janine tugged at the sleeves of her shirt. She said. "Well, she didn't come home this weekend. We had dinner plans on Saturday, but she didn't show up and she didn't call to cancel. I thought she might have been on extended patrol or something, but I couldn't reach her cell phone to check in. I had noticed Marconi's absence but had assumed the same thing as Janine. Some patrol or stakeout had kept her away from the station for a while. Even so, the fact that she hadn't gone home at any point was enough to set off warning bells. It wasn't like Marconi to go so long without keeping in touch. Hell, I could barely get through most mornings without her grilling my ass for one thing or another." "Do you know what case she was working on?" the inspector asked quietly. Janine looked unsure, so I answered for her. "Marconi was looking into the whole thing with those missing campers. Some local teenagers went hiking in the Catamount Forest 3 weeks ago and haven't been seen since. She's been combing the area looking for any trace of those kids." Both Sanchez and the inspector turned to look at me. I probably shouldn't have spoken, but Janine's anxiety was getting to me, and Marconi's safety seemed a lot more important than sticking to procedure. Janine bit her lip and nodded. "Yes, that sounds right," she said. "I think I remember something about that." The next step seemed obvious to me: book it the hell out to Catamount Forest and scour the trees for Marconi and those missing campers. I was just about to grab Sanchez and organize the rescue mission when Janine spoke up again, and boy, was that the kicker that changed everything. "I know where Olivia went," she said faintly. "She was taken by the Wendigo." You could see the precise moment when Sanchez slipped over from sympathetic to skeptical, his brow curled up a bit, his mouth tucking into a frown. The guy had never had the greatest poker face. I looked to the inspector for help, but if the word Wendigo meant anything to him, he didn't show it. He only stood there and ground the tip of his cigar between his teeth. "It lives in the forest," Janine went on, oblivious to the room's sudden shift in mood. "It used to be human, but not anymore. It preys on lost travelers and brings them back to its lair to feed." "I saw it once," she added, as if that settled the matter. Sanchez rose from his chair and gestured for us to talk outside. The officer shifted his belt and led us out into the hall. Through the two-way mirror, we could see Janine stare numbly into space, her hands still trembling. "The lady's nuts," Sanchez concluded. "Marconi's probably got no reception in those woods, that's why we haven't heard from her." Wendigo, my ass. "So Janine is upset and making up stories to cope," I said. "That doesn't change the fact that no one's seen the sheriff for days now. Sanchez, if there's even the slightest shred of a chance Marconi is missing, we've gotta act on that. You know how important the first 48 hours are." The officer looked disgruntled. "I hear you, Hannigan," he said. "But we can't just drop everything and go stomping through the woods looking for her. We don't have the men to spare for an operation that huge." "Then I'll go with the inspector," I said. "We'll canvass as much of the forest as we can. If things get gnarly, we'll get the hell out of there and call for backup." I glanced at my otherworldly partner, who hadn't said a word since we'd stepped outside. He nodded simply. Sanchez shrugged. Your choice, detective. Just keep an eye out for Bigfoot while you're out there. Then he was gone, and it was just me and the inspector standing outside the interrogation room. The tall figure looked paler than I'd even seen him. His grayish skin had taken on the complexion of ash. This, Wendigo, I said under my breath. Is it real? The inspector pondered the question for a few seconds. No, he said. Not as Janine describes it, anyway. Something in those woods may be hunting down campers, but I doubt it was ever human. I ran a hand through my hair and sighed. More monsters. Great. This could be quite dangerous, Mark, the inspector said. We have no idea what kind of entities are out there. Are you sure you want to do this? Marconi needs me, I replied. And so does she. I gestured to the woman sitting alone behind the glass. Janine had stopped shaking, but she was still staring out at nothing, her hand lying limp on the table. As we watched, her fingers closed slightly, then relaxed, as if gripping an invisible hand, for however brief a moment. The inspector rode with me to the Catamount Visitor Center, which seemed as good a place to begin as any. Plenty of dirt trails wound away from the center, and the lost campers, as well as Marconi, would surely have started their hike from here. I pulled my cruiser into the sandy lot and killed the engine. The place was nearly deserted, only a few other vehicles sat beneath the shadows of the treetops. The inspector and I headed for the center and pushed open the stained wooden door. A young couple huddled in the corner over the wall of travel brochures, tourists in the glade, always a rare sight, and a grizzled man in the back was thumping the side of a vending machine, which seemed to have swallowed his dollar. The inspector and I headed to the information desk, where a gray-haired woman in enormous green-rimmed glasses sat reading a home improvement magazine. I cleared my throat. Excuse me, I said. I'm Detective Mark Hennigan, and this is Inspector Smith, from the FBI. We were wondering if you happened to see a woman in a sheriff's uniform come through this area in the last couple of days. The gray-haired woman, presumably Sheila, given her name tag, set aside her magazine and squinted up at us. You mean Olivia? She said. Nice lady. I see her down at the grocer's sometimes. Her voice was high and sweet, like she'd ingested something syrupy. That's her, I said, glancing at the inspector. You're saying she was here recently? Oh yeah, she said. Looking for those campers, you know. Poor things. She began to leaf through her magazine again, as if that settled the conversation. Did she say where she was going? I asked, irritated. Sheila waved a hand toward the door. Said something about checking out Timberwolf Trail. I told her, that's the one the campers took, you know. She flipped the page and peered up at us. You boys looking for them too? Something like that, I muttered. Thank you for your time. I gestured to the inspector that we were done here, and together we headed for the exit. But just as I was reaching for the doorknob, it twisted on its own, and the door flew open from the other side. Standing at the threshold was Janine. She had a camo backpack slung over her shoulder and a water bottle dangling on a strap from her wrist, but otherwise she could have come right from the police station. Oh, she said. I grabbed her arm and ushered her down the stairs, the inspector trailing behind us. The door to the visitor's center swung shut with a low creak. When we were safely out of anyone's earshot, I let go of Janine's arm. I hadn't switched to bad cop mode in God knows how long, but I could feel that old side of me starting to resurface. What the hell were you thinking? I hissed. 4 people have gone missing in these woods and you were just going to wander in all by yourself. Did you even bring any sort of protection? Janine's eyes grew hard, and all of a sudden I saw the same steel in there that I'd seen so often in Marconi. For your information, she growled, I have a compass and a map of the area and the sharpest pocket knife I bet you've ever seen. Then she drew up her baggy shirt, and I saw a pistol tucked into a holster at her waist. And I've got this bad boy, she said. Is that enough protection for you? I looked to the inspector, but he had a wry smile on his face, and I knew I was on my own here. I rubbed my temple and began to pace under the porch light. We can't let you go in there alone, I said at last. Even with a gun, it's just too dangerous. You don't know what's out there. Of course I do, she said. It's a Wendigo. I told you back at the station. I wasn't sure why I was suddenly being so skeptical. Between the two of us, I'd probably seen more weird shit than she would in her entire lifetime, but I just couldn't bring myself to believe in Janine's mystery monster. And that's going to take it down, is it? I said, gesturing to her gun. You're Wendigo. No, she said. Of course not. This is for bears or mountain lions. The Wendigo has its own weakness. She swung the backpack around and unzipped the top pouch. Inside was the largest pile of flares I'd ever seen. It's like Frankenstein's monster, she explained. Can't stand the sight of fire. If it gets too close, I'll light it up. Or burn the forest down, more like it, I muttered. Janine zipped up the bag and gave me a long, pensive look. I have to do this, she said. Olivia's counting on me. If someone you loved was in danger, detective, what would you do? The sympathy card. Damn. Because Janine very well knew that I'd go to the ends of the earth, and further, for my wife and my children. I'd be a dirty rotten hypocrite if I stopped her from doing the same. Fine, I said. I shook my head inside. So you're going Wendigo hunting. Doesn't mean you're going in there alone. The inspector and I are coming too. Janine looked between us, then shrugged. Couldn't hurt, I suppose. But you're going to need some supplies first. Sheila can stock you guys up before we go. How long are you expecting to be out here? The inspector asked. In the shade of the trees I couldn't see his face at all, just a blank stretch of shadow with a speck of embers at the bottom. Janine shifted her backpack over her shoulder and looked somberly at him. As long as it takes, she replied. 10 minutes and a backpack full of hiking essentials later, the 3 of us finally started down Timberwolf Trail. It was a simple dirt path, littered with bumpy rocks and crunchy fallen leaves. Every so often we passed a streak of yellow paint on a rock or a nearby tree. Even without the trail markers, I had a real hard time imagining the campers losing their way. Unless they were complete idiots and had wandered off to explore the woods on their own. A low, thin mist hovered over the landscape, and Janine's form looked a bit fuzzy as she stomped her way along the trail. She had taken the lead without a word, mainly because her long impatient strides kept leaving me in the dust. I shifted the straps of my new backpack and tried to catch up with her. So, this Wendigo, I said. You told us you saw it before. Where was that? Janine ducked under a stray branch. I was on a camping trip with my aunt and uncle, she said. I was young, maybe 12 or so. We were gathered around a campfire when we heard these enormous crunching footsteps and saw a shadow the size of a house moving through the trees. My uncle grabbed a log from the fire and waved it at the shadow, warning it to get back. It stopped for a few seconds, like it was deciding what to do. Then it turned around and disappeared back into the trees. I didn't know what I had seen, but then my uncle told me the legend of the Wendigo, and how it stalked these woods for centuries. She looked at me earnestly. I believed him. After what I'd seen, how could I not? I glanced at the inspector, unconvinced, but he didn't seem to be listening. His head was turned to the trees and his eyes were hidden. He didn't duck under the low branches, but they avoided him all the same, somehow sliding past him without moving an inch. Looking at him for too long made me mildly dizzy, so I turned my eyes back to the trail. Eventually the path tapered off and turned into a leafy clearing, with a warped picnic table and the charred remains of a makeshift fire pit. Janine led us to the table and took a seat, rummaging through her backpack. She pulled out a plastic baggie packed with trail mix and offered it to me. I took a tiny handful of nuts and raisins, popped them in my mouth, and handed the bag back to her. We passed the bag back and forth until half of it was gone. The inspector politely declined when I offered some to him. He seemed distracted. The thin smoke from his cigar drifted into the nearby trees, as if searching for something. We should keep moving, Janine said after a minute or two. She stowed the bag away amid her stack of flares and rose from the table. I wasn't nearly as spry as I used to be, and a few more minutes of rest would have done me good, but Janine was antsy, and she had every right to be. The campers must have spent the night in this clearing, I said, looking around. But they had time to pack up their stuff and keep moving. Whatever happened to them didn't happen here. Janine nodded. We have to go deeper. I turned to call the inspector and nearly jumped out of my skin. He'd somehow approached us without crinkling the leaves under his feet. Maybe it was my imagination, but even his clothes seemed more battered than usual. There were scuffs on his fedora and smudges of something dirty on his trench coat. He said nothing, only tilted his head at the disappearing Janine. I hastily followed her back onto the trail. The mist had thickened while we were resting, and the branches ahead poked like crooked arms out of the gray. Janine's outline, only a few yards away, was barely more than a smudge. I scrambled across the leafy, muddy rocks until I caught up with her. The inspector glided along behind us, his shadow as thin as the trees. How did you meet Marconi anyway? I asked Janine, brushing aside a low-hanging branch. My nephew's a Boy Scout, she replied. He'd gotten his Eagle rank and the troop was hosting a court of honor to celebrate. Olivia had helped with his project, so she came to the ceremony to give a short speech about him. We met at the dinner party afterward. She was the first woman who'd ever shown interest in me. She looked down at the ground and smiled. I liked her. She can be blunt, you must know what she's like, working with her and all, but she's kind, and honest, and she has a good heart. We went on a few coffee and dinner dates before making things official. I tried to imagine Marconi cozying up in a coffee shop or getting dressed up for dinner on the town. It was surprisingly hard. I knew she must have a life outside the precinct, that she didn't always wear uniform blue or tie her hair back in the tightest of ponytails. She had people who loved her, who saw more than just the badge. But I'd known her for so long that my image of her had just stuck. To me, she'd always be my pain-in-the-ass sheriff. You're married, right? Janine said. How did you two meet? I shrugged. High school sweethearts. I know, it's straight out of a sitcom, but that's how it happened. We had a lot of the same classes together and eventually we just got talking. It always felt easy with Ruth. I never felt like I was posturing, trying to make myself look good for her. I was just me. And she appreciated that. My shoes squelched in the mud. We went to separate colleges, but eventually we found our way back to the glade. Everyone does, you know how it is. And we just picked up where we left off. 2 years later we were married. Janine's hand drifted away from the strap of her backpack. Her fingers curled inward, like they had at the station, as if clutching for a hand that was no longer there. Then she lowered her arm. I was going to propose, she said quietly. At dinner this weekend. And when she didn't show up, I thought she knew somehow, and I'd scared her away. I couldn't sleep at all that night. And then she wasn't there the next morning, and she never called to say why, and I knew that something else had happened. Something had gone horribly wrong. Her voice hitched. I don't even care about the proposal anymore. I just want to know she's safe. I reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked over at me, her green eyes sad and empty. We'll find her, I said. You have my word. Janine tried to smile. Her cheeks creased, then slackened. She looked down at the ground again. Then she quickened her pace, trotting through the muck, until she was back to being a vague shadow on the trail ahead. It took another 20 minutes for us to find the first real sign of a disturbance. I had just rounded a particularly tight corner on the mountain trail when the mists parted and I saw Janine standing in front of a charred, blackened tree. The trunk had been cleaved straight down the middle, causing both halves to droop to either side and leaving a small opening in the center. Sap bled from a series of long, deep gashes in the bark, what was left of it, anyway. Was it struck by lightning? I asked, catching my breath. I don't understand, Janine said. The Wendigo hates fire. Why would it burn a tree like this? Because it's not a Wendigo, the inspector said from behind us. He strode forward and ran a thin finger along the trail of drying sap. I thought for sure he was going to taste the stuff, but he simply rubbed his fingers together, leaving sticky strands between them. I've seen this before, he muttered. A long, long time ago. Long enough that I thought they'd gone extinct. They? I asked, not sure I wanted an answer. A tribe of empathic giants, the inspector said. Brutes, most of them, but they figured out how to tear open the rift long before any of us. Their way is messy, destructive, they leave scars whenever they cross between worlds. Scorch marks, poisoned rivers, acid rain. That made it easier for me to track them down. Janine was staring at the inspector in baffled silence, and hell, I didn't blame her, we'd officially taken a left turn into Crazy Town. Wendigos were one thing. This was something else. I backpedaled a bit and tried to parse through what the inspector had just said. Empathic giants. I repeated. What does that mean, exactly? What are we going up against? The inspector knelt by the tree and ran a hand along the blackened wood. They feed on emotions, he said. The time eater we faced swallowed up years, but these creatures, they swallow happiness. Fear. Depression. Hope. Each has a particular taste, and it feeds slowly, keeping its victims in stasis until it can suck them dry. Then it excretes this sap, he held up his sticky fingers, and moves on to the next world, the next food source. Something else about the inspector's story had unsettled me, but before I could pin down what it was, exactly, Janine found her voice. "This thing feeds slowly?" she asked. "So there's still a chance that Olivia might be alive?" I stared at her. The first time I'd heard the inspector spout his alien gibberish, I'd resisted it, and who wouldn't? There just wasn't room in my worldview for beings from outside time and space. It had taken cold, hard evidence for me to erase that doubt. But there was no doubt in Janine's eyes. And I knew, just as she had believed in the Wendigo, that Janine believed the inspector too. She'd believe any narrative that got Marconi home again. "There's always a chance," the inspector said cautiously. He rose back to his full 7 feet. "Keep in mind, though, that by all rights this beast should be dead. It's been lurking here longer than you can possibly fathom. Which means it must be hungry. And hungry beasts aren't known to play with their food." Janine yanked the pistol out of her holster and pointed the gun past the charred tree, into the heart of the mist. "A chance is a chance," she said quietly. "That's enough for me." Then she leaped nimbly over the crack in the wood and hurried into the fog. I shared a glance with the inspector. "Longer than you can possibly fathom?" I whispered. "How fucking old are you, man?" The inspector's eyes were hidden, but the face beneath his fedora looked grim. "Old enough to know what kind of danger we're walking into," he said. "But let's hurry. We can't let Janine get too far ahead." There was so much more I wanted to ask him, but he had a point. We'd have time to talk later. Hopefully. I drew my own pistol, and together we climbed over the splintered remains of the tree and into the underbrush. The inspector was right, whatever we were following had left a whole mess in its wake, which at least left us a clear path to follow. Trees had been torn from their roots and blasted backwards off the trail. Some of the trunks were still smoking. The dirt had a radioactive tint of green, and the leaves under our feet grew crisper and blacker with every step. There was even a hint of ozone in the air. I had felt that same crackle at the abandoned radio station a few cases ago, and my fingers tightened around my pistol at the memory. Janine stayed ahead of us, but never disappeared totally from view. I could always see her shadow climbing over rocks and brushing aside half-visible branches. The fog was getting even worse. The inspector, in all his grayness, seemed to melt into it. I couldn't tell if his cigar had stopped smoking for once or if the mist was so dense I couldn't tell the difference. "Guys?" Janine called back to us. She had stopped several feet away and was staring at something I couldn't see from this distance. I clambered forward and peered into the fog. At first I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Then a twinkle of red flashed in front of me, and I took a startled step back. The air shimmered like waves rippling outward on a body of water. As I continued to stare, I made out vague shapes in the ripples, a single gnarled tree, a pool of brackish water, distant red mesas on a flat horizon. "It's a rip," the inspector said. "A doorway to another dimension. The entity's been here, which means, Janine, no." Without warning, she had run forward and plunged head-on into the shimmering wall of air. There was an enormous sucking sound, like water slurping down a drain, and then Janine's figure was running through that otherworldly red desert. She had made a beeline for the grimy oasis, and suddenly I saw why. There was a body slumped on the ground by the water. "Marconi?" I whispered. I started to follow her, but the inspector grabbed my arm. "Stop," he hissed. "You have no idea what's behind that rip. The air could be toxic, the sun could burn you alive, there could be worse monsters than a Wendigo slumbering there, waiting for prey to wander by dash." "Doesn't matter," I said. If there's even a chance Marconi's alive in there, I have to take it. You get that, don't you? The inspector looked dubious, but after a few tense seconds, he let go of my arm. I didn't wait for him to follow. I raised my gun and hurried after Janine, leaping into the world beyond the rip. For a second the mist was replaced by a brain-splitting white void, and I felt like my body was being stretched, like a piece of human taffy. Then the world snapped back into place and I was running across a sea of gritty red sand. A surprising chill tickled the skin on my neck, despite the enormous sun that hovered precariously in the orange sky. The air seemed breathable, at least, but there was a distinct aftertaste of copper on my tongue that I didn't like one bit. Janine had stopped running and was now staring down at the slumped body on the sand. Fearing the worst, I approached her, but it wasn't Marconi. The corpse in question was a teenage boy wearing tattered khakis and a large beige backpack. His eyes bulged out of his head like peeled grapes and his hair had turned entirely white. Sinewy green vines sprouted from his skin and dug into the ground like a tangle of thick wires. As I watched, the vines pulsed, sending bulbs of faint green light from the body into the sand below. I guess we found one of the missing campers, I muttered, covering my mouth and nose. The coppery stench was 10 times worse over here. The inspector approached from behind me and knelt down over the camper's corpse. His fingers traced the pulsating vines, his brow furrowed. The smoke from his cigar was a thin, weak shade of gray. "Fear," he said. "This particular entity likes to feed on fear. I suppose our poor friend here was afraid of starvation, or isolation, or maybe just wide open spaces. In any case, he's been bled dry. There's nothing we can do for him now." I looked up from the body, feeling mildly sick, and stared off at the horizon. There was something funny about it. I took a few steps past the oasis, and I realized, there was no horizon. The ground literally ended after 100 feet or so. The mesas weren't distant, they were just incredibly small. I turned in circles. For a second I forgot about the dead body. The oasis was smack dab in the center of this desert, and the desert itself was barely more than an island, floating impossibly in that orange sky. If I walked for a minute in any direction, I'd reach the end of the world. "Inspector?" I asked. "What is this place?" The inspector straightened up and looked off at the fake horizon. His skin looked sicklier than usual under the light of the massive sun. He said. "I've heard the empathic giants could create pocket universes to store their food, but I've never actually seen one before. Supposedly they slow the flow of time to keep the victim alive longer, giving the entities a food source for years at a time. Centuries, even." I looked back at the rippling air that led to the misty forest. Through the rip, I could see leaves swirling in a sluggish tornado on the ground, inching along like footage from a stop-motion film. "Olivia's not here," Janine said. She left the camper's body and strode past the gnarled tree. There was another rip not too far away, I noticed. This one spilled over with a green light the color of unripened fruit. Janine approached the tier, set down her backpack, and pulled out a flare from her stockpile. She lit the fuse with a battered lighter and let the flare fall to the sand. Bright red light spat from the tube and cast shadows across the ground. "Bread crumbs," she said. "If time is slow here, this'll last a while. All we have to do is follow it home again." Then she shouldered her backpack and stepped into the rift. There was a familiar slurping sound, and she was gone. I looked at the inspector. He wasn't smiling, exactly, but I could see the faintest glint of admiration in his eyes. "Come on," he said. "Before the flare burns down. We have to follow her." Together, we hurried forward, my body stretched like the world's largest elastic, and then the world snapped back into place. This time we were standing in a sparsely furnished room, its roof open to a roiling green sky. The wood in the walls stretched up until the planks came loose and floated, disjointed, in the void. Janine was already examining the next body. This one was a young woman in jeans and a denim vest, her hair a gleaming white and her dead fingers clutching at a shattered flashlight. The same pulsing vines draped over her corpse and vanished into the woodwork. "Damn it," I muttered. "We're too late." There was no point in poring over the poor girl's body, and besides, Janine had already moved on. There were no doors out of this room, but another rip floated in the air by the far wall. This one emitted a purple glow the color of decaying violets. Janine lit another flare, dropped it on the floorboards, and stepped into the portal. The inspector and I were right on her heels. And so it went. Rip after rip, world after world, we trekked through increasingly bizarre pocket dimensions. One looked like the skeleton of some vast creature with 3 spines and a jawbone the size of a small house. The portal was buried at the base of its tail. Another was turned completely upside down, so that we had to find our footing on a narrow strip of land or fall up into a starless void. Everywhere we went we found more bodies. None of which were Marconi's, thank God, but it still made my stomach turn to see those poor dead campers with their pale skin and bulging eyes. At every stop, without fail, Janine lit another flare to mark our progress. I wondered if she would ever run out of those things. At one point I looked back and saw a dizzying tunnel of flares, a string of lights flashing in scattered, slow-moving patterns. I just hoped they wouldn't go out before we found Marconi. There was no sign of the Wendigo, or the giant, or whatever the hell we were chasing here, and for a while I thought we might make it to the end of this cosmic maze without running into the damn thing at all. But then the last portal dumped us into a huge cave covered with glowing specks of lichen, and there it was, a hulking, humanoid shape slumped in the corner, so quiet and so still it might have been a statue. But I knew it was the Wendigo. The crackle of ozone in the air was so strong I could feel my nose starting to bleed. "Olivia!" Janine hissed. And there she was. Marconi was propped up against the wall of the cave, still wearing her sheriff's uniform, vines slithering from her exposed arms into the rock. From this distance I couldn't tell if she was breathing. The images of the camper corpses wouldn't leave my head, and when Janine broke into a run, I was only a few steps behind her. Our footsteps were muffled by the blanket of lichen on the cave floor, but I had no idea if the Wendigo was asleep or resting or just faking it, and I wasn't going to make a ruckus in order to find out. At one point Janine and I had to stop due to a deep chasm that opened up suddenly in front of us, leaving us only with a narrow footbridge. The bottom of the pit was too far down to make out, but I could see the glint of sharp stalagmites jutting out of the darkness. The two of us crossed the bridge as quickly as we dared, the inspector gliding along behind us on his usual silent footsteps. Once we were safely on the other side, Janine rushed to Marconi and cupped the sheriff's cheeks in her hands. There were definitely strands of gray in her hair, but her eyes were closed, and the rise and fall of her chest was unmistakable. Marconi was alive. I almost sank to my knees in the lichen, I was so relieved. But Janine was tugging at Marconi's shoulders now, and the sheriff refused to budge. The vines were wrapped so tightly around her she was bound to the cave wall. Every few seconds, Pulses of bright green light traveled down the vines, sliding from her arm into the wall of stone. Janine tried yanking at the vines, but they were embedded deep in Marconi's skin. The pulses grew brighter, as if sensing Janine's resistance, and Marconi shifted slightly inside her tangled prison. The inspector appeared suddenly by my side. "I don't mean to rush you," he said, his voice low and oddly calm, "but we have company." I whirled around. The hulking shape in the corner had risen from its crouched position, and now a behemoth of a shadow blocked out the light from the glowing lichen. Before I'd thought of it as humanoid, but there was something wrong about it, something about the curve of its limbs and the blocky, misshapen head slumped on its broad shoulders. It was too dark to make out its facial features, if it had any at all. I couldn't tell if it had skin or scales or fur or feathers. It was just darkness, darkness made solid, and I could only stand and stare as the beast took a rumbling step toward us. I lifted my gun, for all the good it would do, but the inspector moved before I could. 1 second a man was standing in front of me, and the next, well, it's hard to say. Outwardly the inspector looked the same, but I had the strange sense that he'd grown to enormous proportions, like a giant squeezed into a tiny body. It reminded me of that night he'd shown me his true form on the highway. The figure I knew was just a vessel, a puppet, its strings being yanked by something large and invisible. Looking at him made my head throb. The inspector reared back and punched the shadowy beast. His fist struck like a meteor, leaving a fiery imprint on the creature's hide, causing it to bellow and stumble back. The floor of the cave trembled with each footstep. For half a second I hoped it would fall backwards into the chasm, but the Wendigo only took a second or two to regain its footing. It lumbered forward and batted at the inspector with a clawed, misshapen hand. I fired a single shot at the incoming limb, but the bullet sank into its hide with a sound like a muffled thwump. Then the inspector was flying across the cave. His whole body went limp, as if the invisible puppeteer had left it, and when he struck the far wall he slumped into a curled position on the ground. The cigar dropped from his lips and rolled away. Its tip smoldered for a second or two, then went out. "No!" I shouted, feeling something snap inside me. I fired another 3 shots at the Wendigo, but the bullets only seemed to irritate it. It turned its monstrous head to look at me, and I saw a bulbous globe of eyeballs peering out of its skull, each one bloodshot and vaguely human. It took a threatening step forward. A tremor swept across the ground and knocked me off my feet, whacking my hand against the stone and causing the gun to skitter out of my grip into the darkness. I didn't bother looking for it. What was the point? This thing had already proven itself immune to bullets, and if the inspector couldn't leave a dent on it, what chance did I have? I looked to Janine, as if to apologize, but she wasn't staring at me, or even the Wendigo. She had managed to pry a few of the vines off of Marconi's face and was kissing her on the lips, tears streaming down her cheeks. Another step, another tremor. Rocks came loose from the walls and tumbled around our feet. If one of those came down on our heads we'd be done for, Wendigo or not. The creature was leaning down now, blinking its mismatched eyes. I scrambled back against the wall, but there was no time to stand, no time to run, just to cower. The Wendigo swung its massive hand downward, the air whooshing as it did so, and I found myself thinking suddenly of Ruth's face, Ruth and the kids, and I closed my eyes so I could see them one last time. Then the Wendigo faltered. I opened my eyes. Its hand had halted, hovering, just a few feet above our heads. For a second I thought, absurdly, that my memory of Ruth had somehow stopped the creature in its tracks. Then I saw that Marconi was standing. She had her hand on Janine's shoulder, and even though a web of vines still trailed from her skin into the wall, her eyes were awake and clear. And she was pissed. "Hey, shit for brains," she yelled. "Why don't you back up?" The vines pulsed, but instead of the usual green, a hot red light traveled down Marconi's arms and into the stone. The Wendigo yowled like a wounded mountain lion and lifted its hands to its ears, as if Marconi's voice had ruptured whatever passed for its eardrums. Marconi took a step forward, and the vines moved with her, snaking across the ground. "You don't scare me," she shouted. "You Bigfoot wannabe." The Wendigo made a series of dissonant yaps and staggered backwards. The cave trembled again, and I leaped aside as a boulder the size of our minivan came crashing down where I'd been standing. Marconi and Janine didn't seem bothered by the potential cave-in. They stood together, framed in the light of the lichen, two small figures in all that trembling vastness. "And one more thing," Marconi said. She'd lowered her voice, but it still carried through the cavern as if she'd spoken through a megaphone. "Stay away from my friends." The Wendigo took another step back, but its foot slipped on the lip of the chasm, and suddenly it was plummeting like a felled sequoia. The enormous dark shape slipped out of view. I was afraid to move. What if it came crawling out of the pit, more pissed off than ever? Then something black and gooey spurted upward, followed by the loudest and most agonizing howl of pain I'd ever heard. The walls gave one final tremble. Then the cave fell silent. Janine let out a choked laugh and flung her arms around Marconi. The vines had slipped from her skin like desiccated four tubes, shriveling into nothing on the cave floor. Marconi wrapped Janine in a tight squeeze and spun her in a circle, her hiking boots barely brushing the ground. "God damn," I breathed. "How the hell did you do that, Marconi?" The sheriff noticed me for the first time. Her hair was streaked with gray and her cheeks were gaunter than I remembered, but the smirk on her face was 100% Marconi. I hadn't realized how damn much I'd missed that smirk. "Should have known you'd be involved in this shit, Hannigan," she said. "And you. Of course you're here." I turned to see the inspector approaching us, and relief flooded through me so strong I felt a little dizzy. His body didn't seem to have taken much of a beating, but his trench coat was torn and dirty, and his fedora had been knocked askew. The cigar was back in his mouth. It was still thin though, barely more than a cigarette, and it didn't smoke at all. The tip simply glowed a low orange, I said. "I thought you were done for." The inspector's smile was faint. "Yes, well, I've been through worse," he said. "But I'm afraid we don't have time to stand around celebrating. Now that the giant is dead, this universe, and all the ones it created, will come undone. We have to go." I peered through the gloom, trying to make out the flash of Janine's flares amid all the lichen. And there it was, bright orange sparks spitting in slow motion. We had to cross the footbridge to reach it. Even as the thought crossed my mind, a rock fell from the ceiling and smashed through one of the wooden planks. That familiar trembling picked up again, and this time, I was afraid there'd be no stopping it. A loud keening sound filled the air and made my eardrums rattle. "Can you walk?" Janine asked Marconi. The sheriff took a few shaky steps and nodded. Supporting one another, the two of them moved toward the footbridge as quickly as they dared. Rocks continued to fall around them, pebbles mostly, although there were some large chunks in there too, and one glance across the skull would cut our journey short in a second. "We need to go, Mark," the inspector said in his warning voice. There was no time to search for my gun, so I hurried after the couple, arms shielded against the plummeting debris. The bridge groaned and creaked under us. It was almost as if the wood was decaying before our eyes, but we made it across in one piece, and together we lunged for the exit. The portal slurped around us, stretching us like an agonizing rubber band, before snapping us back and dumping us in an apocalyptic wasteland. 10 feet away, Janine's flare sputtered and went out. "I see the next one," she shouted. A hot wind had picked up, bellowing in our ears. The tremors of the cave had followed us here, and cracks were zigzagging across the dried soil. Janine held on to Marconi as we staggered through the wasteland toward the source of sparkling light. Portal after portal, we emerged in worlds that were falling apart. The upside-down universe had been knocked askew, so we had to cling to the ground or fall sideways into space. The rickety old house had developed a sinkhole in the floor that we had to creep around. The ribcage of the massive creature had splintered and our way forward was almost buried under piles of jutting bones. In that case, and in a couple others, the inspector had to lift the debris out of our way so we could climb through and move on. The desert world had split into several distinct chunks, and I was worried that Marconi wouldn't be able to cross it in her condition. But she clutched Janine's hand and leapt over gap after gap, the inspector and I trailing after them, until at last we reached the window out and stumbled back into Catamount State Forest. The inspector turned back to do something to the portal. There was a loud wrenching sound, like someone tearing a branch off a tree, and when I glanced behind me, I didn't see anything except misty forest. The pocket universe was gone. I was beyond fatigued, and I'm sure the others were too, but we didn't stop to rest. We were deep in mountain lion territory here and it wouldn't do to get too complacent. So we followed the trail as fast as Marconi could manage, clambering over fallen trees and squelching through the mud. We didn't stop until we reached the empty clearing where the poor lost campers had set up their fire pit. Janine and Marconi took a seat at the picnic table, but the inspector stood off at the edge of the clearing, staring out into the forest. I went over to join him. "You haven't been you lately," I said. "Ever since we started this case. You look tired, your skin is sickly, hell, even your cigar looks different. What happened to you?" The inspector's lips tightened around the aforementioned cigar. He let out a heavy breath, but only a few wisps of steam curled around the tip, and they were gone in no time. He sighed, took the cigar out of his mouth, and tapped some ash onto the leaves. "I don't belong here," he said quietly. "I never did. Sometimes I forget that. Being in your world, helping you fight these entities, it gives me purpose, but it drains me. I can only stay here for so long, only exert so much of my energy, before I need to return home. To recharge, if you will." "Is that where you went in the cave?" I asked. "After the Wendigo attacked you." I remembered the way his body had slumped against the stone, how his whole form looked hollowed out. "It was like the lights went out in your eyes." I retreated, yes. The inspector reached up and adjusted his fedora. "For a minute or so. I didn't want to leave you, but the giant had wounded me badly, and survival is an instinct we all share. I thought a quick dip behind the rift would give me enough strength to fight the creature again. But when I returned, Sheriff Marconi had the situation under control. He was twirling a small object between his fingers. I saw now, a thin gray capsule with bulbed ends and a large crack running through the middle. Across the center, a peeling label in faded red letters read Capra. "What's that?" I asked. The inspector glanced at me, then pocketed the capsule. "Something I need to look into further," he said. "But nothing you need to concern yourself with. Not yet." He let out another reedy wisp of smoke and said, "Perhaps you should check on Sheriff Marconi." I could take a hint. Leaving the inspector to his arcane, eldritch thoughts, I walked over to Janine and Marconi at the picnic table. The sheriff seemed to have regained some strength. The hand clutching Janine's was firm and pink, and there was a rosy glow to her cheeks that had been absent in the Wendigo's cave. The two women looked up at me when I approached. "You never answered my question back there," I said. "How did you beat that thing?" Marconi turned to look at Janine. Her hand clenched, and I saw Janine return the gesture, that same squeeze of closeness, this time with a hand to grip back. "Janine told me it fed on fear," she said. "So I gave it the opposite." "Of course." I took a seat next to the two women and stared out into the forest. The mist was starting to clear, even as the sky was darkening, and the tree branches stretching out in front of us seemed to float in a dusky cloud. A mountain lion yowled somewhere in the distance. Fireflies drifted through the twilight. The forest was alive, and we were alive, and even though we hadn't been able to save everyone today, I felt good. "You realize I'm in this now, right, Hannigan?" Marconi said. 100%. If anything else comes after the people I love in this town, I want to help. And I want to know everything that's going on with you and that tall drink of water over there. I looked back at the inspector. In the darkening light he looked more like a statue than ever. The tip of his cigar could have been one of the floating fireflies. I thought of him tearing that cigar from his mouth and igniting the old radio tower. I thought of him wrestling with the Time Eater at the lip of Skokomish Bluffs. He was a dynamo, a source of incredible power, and it was strange to see him so dimmed. We'd been through so much, the inspector and I, but I wondered if I would ever really know the guy. "You got a couple of hours?" I said. This could take a while. And as the forest turned to night around us, I told them everything. Third story. This story was shared by you/a regretful Piercy. There were two Wendigo outside my dad's house last night. So, last night my friends and I were driving around aimlessly and ended up on the side of town near my deceased father's house. I go there from time to sit on the steps, say hi, and that I miss him, and since every year for Valentine's Day since I was a kid my dad was my Valentine, I really wanted to stop by the house and give it a hug, but I don't think I'm going back. At around 11 p.m., we stop at the top of the road and I run down the exponential function of a driveway and run up to the garage and hug the house before quickly running up the stairs to the front porch. I rest my head on the front door, telling the house and my dad that I missed being there, and that I missed him. I feel a hand on my shoulder, and I feel my entire body start shaking like I'm sobbing when only a few tears run down my face. Just as this overwhelming feeling starts to come over me and I feel lightheaded, my friend, Duke, calls me. "Alex. Get back to the car. Right now. I'll explain why when you get here." Without hesitation, I sprint up the icy driveway without stopping, thank God without slipping and falling. When I get to the car we take off doing 50, down the road. I'm still crying and can barely breathe and my best friend Riley kept asking me if I'm okay and if I need anything. When I'm able to pull myself together I ask what made them call me back to the car. Duke doesn't say anything for a few minutes and keeps driving while I keep pestering him about what he saw that made him call me. When we get to a stop sign he grips the wheel tighter and says he saw a head poking out behind my dad's house, a little bit taller than the garage doors. After a minute of silence, I asked him what it looked like, a big Wendigo. Duke said it popped its head out around the side of the house 2 times, and by the time I was sprinting down the stairs Riley saw another head come out behind the neighbor's house. Initially, she had thought was a dog head but soon realized the head was too massive to be a dog's. We take off down the road and all go and crash at my house after getting some McDonald's, with Duke checking the windows until we had fallen asleep. I think he may have spotted another one outside my house. My dog was flipping out all night and trying to get to all the doors in my house at once, and I didn't fall asleep until the sun came up. I don't know what happened. I don't know why my whole body was shaking and why I felt I was going to pass out, but I think my dad protected me. And I know I'm not going back to that house. Fourth story. This story was shared. Wendigo encounter. This is a repost. I had to fix some spacing errors. I am not sure if this is the right place to post this, but I am scared shitless. After hearing stories and looking stuff up online, I'm fairly sure it was a Wendigo. Me, my son and girlfriend were attacked by something. We were camping up in the northernmost area of Washington. My girlfriend is incredibly superstitious, so she insisted we brought weapons. So I had my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, and she brought a .22 rifle alongside a newly sharpened machete. Our son was just 3 years old at the time. She and I were set on edge from a park ranger, who seemed very tense and uneasy, who stopped us and instead of confiscating our weapons told us to be careful and stay safe, then sent us along our way to the camp. When we got there, we were informed that several visitors had spoken about some unnatural noises and a pale creature that would mimic voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or seeming to be distracted. I laughed and put the idea out my mind, thinking to myself, there's no way. They're fucking with us. But I knew better. So we then reached the area we were going to set up camp. We immediately got a fire ready to light and set up our tent and bags. I fed my son as my girlfriend ate a snack. We decided to get a lay of the area, so me and my girlfriend hiked around for about an hour or so. I had one of those baby carrying backpacks and my son started to get real heavy. Everything seemed normal until I saw something down the almost path we were on. We walked closer to investigate and saw drag marks. It looked as if someone had killed a buck. There was a whole outline in the dirt with a small dried pool of blood, as if someone grabbed it from the antlers and pulled. That wouldn't be possible for any man to do. The buck, or whatever it was, would have been way too big for that. Shaken, we rushed back to base camp and restarted the fire and hurried back into our tent. Too afraid to leave since it was dusk by now, we stayed inside the tent and my girlfriend put our son to bed. Eventually, probably from the exhaustion of fright, we fell asleep. What must have been hours later, I awoke to a faint rasping sound that sounded like a child crying. I gazed outside in confusion and saw the outline of a creature that seemed to be a buck, standing over something. It seemed to be about 20 feet away. But at a closer glance had unnaturally long limbs for a buck, and was eerily tall. In sudden fear, I unloaded 2 shots into the creature and heard a loud blood-curdling cry. My girlfriend awoke screaming to the shots I had fired as I tried to explain what I had heard. To my surprise, the animal hadn't moved an inch. Then I noticed the stains on the side of the animal. It looked like blood was running down the edge, and lots of it. It stared at me deep into my eyes as I became petrified with fear. A sinister feeling of dread fell over me as if it knew I could not move. I thought to myself, what if it starts to bolt towards us? Just then, this tall, decrepit demonic thing seemed to whisper something. I could not exactly tell what it was saying, but it seemed to have said, "I need more children." My girlfriend screamed, asking where our son was. We blacked out. In the morning we awoke to park rangers at our campsite. We did not see our son anywhere. We told the rangers that he was missing and they started a search party. I explained what had happened and strangely they seemed to believe it. The one who seemed to be older by at least a decade pulled along the one we met earlier and whispered in his ear. I only heard a single line and I'm not even sure if what I heard was correct. It sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't seem to want us by ourselves, so they waited with us while they continued the search. We stayed in a log cabin for 3 days with a forest ranger. When suddenly some rangers came into the cabin saying they could not find our son. My girlfriend starts to sob. I start to hate myself thinking that I could have done something if I was not frozen in fear. We rushed outside only to find some injured and frightened police officials. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything of what happened or what they saw. Or why the cops were scared shitless. All we know is that we do not have a son anymore. God help whoever goes into that forest next, and please don't bring your kids with you. Fifth story. The Thing in the Fields. This story was shared by you/Snake973, so credits to him. When I was young, I lived on a farm in rural Oregon with my parents. I was the only child. We weren't a big commercial farm. Just a family type thing. We had 5 cows, 3 horses, a small herd of goats, 2 dogs, and 1 chicken coop. We also had some Indian runner ducks we kept mostly as pets. We didn't really make any money off the place, just enough to sustain the animals and a little extra for ourselves. Money enough to take a decent vacation every couple of years. Dad had his other job in town, an insurance agent. He was the only one around really. The town wasn't more than about 1,500 people. Mom gave horse riding lessons as well. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. It was really an easy life, or at least it could have been a lot worse. I went to school, Dad went to work, Mom took care of the animals, then we all had dinner together every night, and I would go to bed while Mom and Dad had a beer or 2 and watched the news. Sometimes at night I would hear things outside. Mostly just normal stuff. The cows or horses would get spooked by a coyote or something, or I would hear the dogs chasing a rabbit, barking their heads off. Every once in a great while we would find a chicken dead. Dad would always tell me about it but never let me see the body, although I asked frequently. He would keep Mom and I inside until he had gone out, did whatever he did with the body, throw sawdust over any blood, and then life would go on as normal. I assumed it was foxes, as I had seen a couple of them out in the pasture over the years, slinking around back and forth through the grass. The summer when I was 10 years old, I remember helping Mom change the bedding in the horse stalls, when we heard a huge racket going on outside. If you've never heard the sounds of a horse in pain, you don't want to, trust me. It sounds almost like a person screaming. Well, that's what we heard, and one of our horses, the Palomino, came running into the barn with a wound on its left thigh. 4 long marks, like claw marks, ran across its body for about a foot. It had blood running down its leg, and was limping. I was so scared by the sight of that much blood that Mom locked the horse in a stall and made me go inside with one of the dogs. She told me to lock the door and stay inside until she came in to get me. I did. Eventually Mom came inside and told me that the horse had hurt itself on the barbed wire that ran the perimeter of the pasture. We owned more land beyond that, but it was mostly forested. I guess I believed her at the time, but at dinner that night I noticed Dad was being particularly quiet and Mom was talking a lot more than she normally did. She was being really animated, and I noticed that Dad had gotten his rifle out and set it by the back door. Usually he only did that when the coyotes had been acting up. That night I went to bed as normal, but I had trouble falling asleep. I turned on my desk lamp and decided to read comic books until I got tired. I have a very vivid memory of reading Uncanny X-Men and hearing the back door open. Looking out, I could see my dad by the porch light, lighting a cigarette and holding his rifle under his arm. He started walking over to the driveway and then turned to follow the fence line. I couldn't sleep until I knew Dad was back safe. I kept coming downstairs with the excuse of getting water to see if Dad was back in the house yet, and each time all I saw was Mom sitting on the couch in the living room, staring at a blank TV screen and looking worried, sighing occasionally. Eventually, about 4 in the morning, I think, Dad did come back, and I was so tired and relieved that I fell asleep as soon as I knew he was home. He never told me what he did that night, but I never thought to ask. 2 months later I was back in school. It rains a lot in Oregon in the fall, and this day was no different. All I could hear from my bedroom was rain hitting the ground and the aluminum roof of the chicken coop. There was light thunder in the distance, but it was slowly getting closer. I thought I had heard a coyote yapping out around the garage, or it could have been one of the dogs. I looked out, straining my eyes to see whatever there may have been. In a brief and distant lightning flash I saw something. It looked almost like a person, but hunched over, and with a long torso. It was tall, taller than Dad, who was a good 6'4", at least. I just barely caught a glimpse of it on the near side of the garage, then the light faded and I didn't see it again that night. There was another dead chicken the next morning. The third in just as many weeks. I told Dad what I had seen the previous night. The color went out of his cheeks momentarily, until he told that the storm must have been playing tricks on me. I accepted that. For months after that we lost a cow. It was in the middle of the night, and we all woke up at the same time. There was a lot of noise in the pasture, but only briefly. The cry of a dying animal, and a primitive, guttural yell that I had never heard before. Dad rushed up to my room. I could hear him running up the stairs to my room. He had his rifle in hand, and opened my door. He saw I was awake and told me to stay inside no matter what and try to go back to sleep. I don't think I have to say that sleep wasn't really an option any longer, but I did stay in my room, with a blanket held tight around my shoulders and staring out the window. Probably about 10 minutes later I heard gunshots in the field. I don't know what he was shooting at, whether it was whatever had attacked the cow, or the cow itself, trying to put the animal out of its misery. Dad rarely, if ever, talked about that night. I later found out that he had gotten to the cow only to find it ripped open on the ground, bleeding out from its torso. The shots I heard were him shooting the cow in the head. It kept going like that. For years. A chicken or a duck here and there. Something bigger only very rarely. It sounds absurd, but I almost came to think of it as commonplace. I only ever caught glimpses of the thing until what comes next. It terrified me. It happened in the middle of the day, over the course of a long weekend when my parents had gone to Seattle to see my uncle, who was ill. It was on a Saturday afternoon. I was 17 years old. I was out in the barn putting out food for the horses and the dogs. The horses were running around out in the pasture and the dogs were asleep in the corner of one of the horse stalls. I heard something rustling in the tall grass outside in the pasture. The dogs looked around a little bit but didn't seem to mind. I assumed it was just one of the horses waiting for me to leave so they could eat. I kept going about what I was doing, and in several minutes I thought I heard breathing. I turned to look and it was standing in the door. Tall as hell, even hunched over. The sun was streaming in behind it, lighting up all the dust in the air around it like some kind of sickly halo. It was looking at me. Considering me. Maybe it was trying to decide whether or not I was food. I remember swearing, turning, and running as fast as I could for the house, not even thinking. Panic causing my legs to move. It was behind me, not even breathing hard. I heard its feet hitting the ground in a constant rhythm. I got to the house, opened the door, slammed it behind me and locked it as fast as I could. I tore through the house, locking every door, and drawing the blinds on every window. I could hear it snarling outside the back door. The dogs were barking at it, but they wouldn't try to attack the thing. It was too big and they knew it. It roared at the dogs and they ran off, probably to hide in the pasture. I went to my parents' bedroom and got Dad's rifle. I loaded it, set up a chair in the living room facing the back door, and waited. It started prowling around the house. I could hear its feet crunching on the gravel of the driveway and the wooden planks of the back deck. It kept walking, back and forth. I thought about trying to look through a window to see it, but I was too scared. Eventually, after hours of hoping it would go away, the sun went down. I turned on all of the outside lights and went up to my room. I opened my window, with the rifle in my hands, hoping to be able to pick the thing off from above. I saw it lurking just beyond the glow from the porch light. It had long, sinewy arms, and walked on bent knee. It was by the chicken coop. Then it disappeared from view. I heard the chicken squawking and screeching. The thing reappeared with a dead, bloody chicken in its hands. It bit off one of the wings with jaws that were dripping with slime and drool and let the dead bird drop to the ground at its feet. Then it looked at me. Its eyes made contact with my eyes. It turned away again, back to the chickens. It came back with another bird, mutilated it in front of me, and dropped it. It went back again. And again. I should have taken a shot at it, but I was astounded and confused trying to figure out what it was doing. Then it hit me. It was a show of power. It was showing me that it was stronger than me. That it could do whatever it wanted to do because I couldn't stop it. At the same time I felt powerless and sickened. Powerless because what it was saying was true. If it was just that thing in me, I wouldn't stand a chance. Sickened because I realized what kind of intelligence it would need to be able to convey that message. The thought shook me out of my stupor and I remembered the rifle at my side. It was heading back to the chickens, and I decided that when it came back I would take my shot. It strode back to the porch. Almost arrogant, walking on bended knee with those arms so long that the chicken was nearly dragging on the ground. I raised the rifle up to my eye, and tried to steady myself. My heart was beating so hard I could see the rifle shaking ever so slightly in rhythm with each heartbeat I could hear pounding in my own ears. It raised the body to its mouth and just as it was about to put the chicken's head inside, I squeezed the trigger. The crack of the gun echoed in the now shattered quiet of the nighttime standoff and I heard it howl. A painful, loud, startled howl. I had hit it on the outside of the shoulder. It ran off into the night. I never saw it again. It was still out there, though. It still killed chickens, and other things. More often than before. I'm writing all of this now because my parents died 3 weeks ago. They were killed in a collision with a drunk driver. He survived. They left me the farm, and I intend to live here with my own family. I'm 32 now, and I work for an Oregon Fish and Game office in Salem. I'm married to a wonderful woman named Stephanie. We have one son, Zachary, who is 4 years old. We are expecting a daughter in 4 months. I've come to the farmhouse alone today. I told Steph that I just wanted some time alone in my parents' house. to deal with some emotions. She was very understanding. I've come back to claim what is rightfully mine. I have Dad's rifle next to me on the table and it is almost dusk. I've also brought several portable halogen lights to set up around the house, and my own shotgun. I'm borrowing a handgun from Joe, a guy at Fish and Game who I work with. When I am done typing this account of my memories, I will print it out, and leave it on the dining room table, along with my wedding ring and my key to the safe deposit box where my will is kept. Everything is loaded and ready. Hopefully I will return here to collect these things and nobody will ever know I wrote this. Steph, in the event that you are the unfortunate soul to find this, which I'm terrified to think seems a likely outcome, the thought of you having to go on alone hurts me more than anything in this world ever can. Know that I love you more than anything and I hope you understand that I am doing this to keep you safe. Zachary, I love you and can only hope you grow up to be a good, kind-hearted, and strong man like your grandfather was. To my unborn daughter, if I don't live long enough to meet you, it will be the single greatest regret of my life. Tell the police, tell Fish and Game, call Joe, he's one of the few people who knows about this. Make this situation known. Eventually someone will kill it, even if it isn't me. Goodbye for now. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.